The most dangerous man in Providence sat alone in a shabby little diner just after dawn. One scarred hand wrapped around a coffee cup that had long gone cold, his gray eyes lost somewhere far beyond the frosted glass. Vincenzo Falcone was 37 years old, and he wore his power the way other men wore their coats, quietly, completely, without ever needing to raise his voice. He'd built an empire out of the harbor's shadows, out of shipping routes no honest man asked about, out of loyalty bought and fear earned. But this morning he wasn't running an empire. This morning he was mourning, because 6 years ago to the day, his younger brother had died in front of him. And Vince had never forgiven himself for the single second he'd hesitated before reaching for his gun. So every year he came back to this cracked vinyl booth, where the two of them once split a single plate of eggs when they had nothing, and he sat in silence, letting the old wound bleed where no one could see it. He almost didn't notice the waitress refilling his cup, a tired young woman named Ruby, maybe 27, with careful eyes, a fading bruise she'd learned to hide beneath her sleeve, and the kind of exhaustion that comes from working 2 jobs and still not being able to save a sick child. She didn't know who he was. Or maybe she did, and simply had bigger fears than him. Then something moved beyond the window. At first, Vince thought it was the wind dragging trash along the curb. But the shape rose huge, black and silent, a Neapolitan Mastiff with a battle-scarred hide and ribs pressing through matted fur, digging through the frozen garbage behind the diner. The dog wasn't frantic. It wasn't begging. It pulled each scrap free with strange, deliberate care, then carried the food away instead of swallowing it, as though something depended on it somewhere out of sight. Vince had seen killers with less discipline. He watched the animal work, and for reasons he couldn't name, he couldn't look away. Then the great black dog dragged something red from beneath the slush and broken paper, a worn leather collar, cracked and faded, dangling from its jaws like a small ember against the snow, and the dog lifted its head, and it looked, not at the diner, not at the warmth or the food or the people inside. It looked straight through the glass, straight at Vincenzo Falcone, and the most feared man in the city went cold, because he recognized that collar, and every rule he'd ever built his life on told him that was impossible. Why did one silent stare stop a ruthless man dead? What was that scarred dog guarding out there in the cold, and whose faded red collar was hanging from its mouth, a collar Vince was certain had vanished into thin air on the very night he lost his brother? If you're the kind of person who believes even the hardest heart can still be reached, do us a quick favor, tap that like button, share this story with someone who needs it today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss what comes next. Now let's head back to that quiet diner, where one cold morning, one starving dog, and one impossible red collar are about to unravel a secret 6 years in the making. Providence had never slept the way decent people like to imagine it did, and Vincenzo Falcone understood that better than any man still breathing in this city, because the hidden pulse beneath the frost and fog of the harbor was the very thing he had spent nearly 20 years learning to take hold of and tighten in the palm of his hand. People told one another that no crate came into Providence harbor without his knowing it, that no truck rolled down the East Coast at midnight without the Falcone family having a share in it, and that the men who had once tried to outmaneuver him had either learned the art of silence or learned something far more permanent than silence. But Vince didn't rule by shouting the way the bosses in movies made people imagine. He ruled through stillness, by stepping into a room and letting the room lower its own voice, by giving a slight nod that was enough to drain the color from a grown man's face, by remembering exactly who owed him what and who had once held his gaze 1 second longer than was safe. His power was clean in a way that chilled the blood, tailored perfectly to him, like the charcoal gray suit he was wearing, like the leather shoes without a single smear of mud, though he had just crossed a street slick with melting snow, like the neatly combed hair touched with silver at the temples, making him look at once like a banker and like something a banker would pay, never to meet. And yet, of all the places where he could have chosen to stop, this morning he was sitting here, inside a shabby diner tucked into the corner of Federal Street, where the smell of fried grease clung to the walls and the ceiling fan turned slowly, as though it too had grown tired of the world, and he sat there not as a boss, but as a man carrying inside his chest something no amount of money could ever buy back. Outside, parked close to the curb in the cold breath of the morning, his glossy black car waited like a patient animal, and leaning against its door was Angelo Ferraro, 33 years old, the young man Vince trusted more than men who had walked beside him for twice that many years. Angelo never asked why, every year on this exact day, his boss made him drive to this cheap diner that wasn't worth a penny of the family's accounts. Never asked why Vince always went in alone and always sat at that same table beside the window. Never asked why, when he came back out, there was always something broken in his eyes that he hurriedly buried beneath the familiar layer of steel. Angelo only stood there, hands buried in the pockets of his overcoat, watching the street with a vigilance that had seeped into his blood and allowing his boss to have the one rare thing no one in this whole city dared give him, which was privacy. Because Angelo understood, though he had never been told, that this diner was a grave Vince had built for himself out of memory. Many years earlier, when the name Falcone had meant nothing more than two hungry children, born to a drunken father and a mother who had left before she had even managed to teach them how to forgive. Vince and his younger brother had once split every loose coin between them in this very room, had ordered a single plate of eggs and pushed the larger portion toward each other in that game of pretending to be full that only the truly hungry know how to play. Here, on this cracked vinyl seat, his younger brother had once smiled at him, with a smile Vince would never again see on anyone else for the rest of his life. And it was that same brother who had believed in him when no one else in the world did, who had followed him into the darkness Vince built, and who had finally paid for that faith with the most expensive thing a human being could have. Vince didn't come here to remember glorious days, because he didn't believe in glory. He believed only in the price that had to be paid, and in debts that could never be collected. He came here every year to sit in silence thick enough for the part of him he had buried with his brother to rise and breathe just once, before being forced back down for the remaining 364 days. He lifted the cup of coffee, already gone cold, to his lips, then set it down again without drinking, a small habit he himself didn't even notice, as though letting something grow cold in his own hand was a punishment he had chosen for himself, a reminder that he had once let something far more precious go cold forever, because he had been one heartbeat slower than fate. Around him, the diner kept moving to its old worn rhythm, the clatter of bowls and plates, the dry cough of an old man in the far corner, the jingle of the bell above the door each time someone stepped in from the cold, and not one of them knew that the man sitting quietly by the window could erase half the list of his enemies with a single phone call. To them, he was only a gentleman dressed too elegantly for the neighborhood, a polite shadow drinking coffee without making conversation, and Vince let them think that, because of all the masks he had worn, the mask of an unknown man among ordinary people was the only one that made him feel close to the man he might once have become. He glanced out the window toward Angelo standing watch, tilted his head slightly to signal that he was all right, then turned back to his coffee and to the empty space no one could fill. It was in that numb, silent moment, while the city outside still curled in on itself beneath fog and sin, that Vincenzo Falcone had no idea this morning would be unlike any morning of remembrance he had ever lived through, and that something was drawing near to that pane of glass, carrying with it a fragment of the past he had thought he had buried deep, carefully, far beyond the reach of daylight, for Ruby Callahan. Morning didn't begin when the sun came up. It began at 4 o'clock, in the darkness of a cramped, one-bedroom apartment on the third floor of an old building, when she lay listening to her daughter's breathing through the thin wall and counted each breath as though sheer will alone could keep them steady. Poppy was only 5, tiny and pale in the careful way doctors used careful words to describe. A heart born with one place that didn't close all the way, a valve that wouldn't do the work it was supposed to do, and every time the little girl ran too fast or laughed too long, her lips would take on a faint bluish shade that made Ruby go still in the middle of whatever she was doing. The surgery the child needed came with a number attached to it, and that number was so large that every time Ruby thought of it, it didn't feel like money at all, but like a concrete wall standing straight up across her daughter's future. She had sold her wedding ring long ago, not out of feeling but out of practicality, because the man who had once slipped it onto her finger had left 2 years earlier, and had left behind him not memories to miss, but a stack of bills under both their names, loans he had signed and she had to repay, and a wariness that had sunk deep into the way she stood, the way she kept her distance from tall men, the way she always knew exactly where the nearest door was in any room she entered. She didn't tell that story to anyone, not because she was ashamed, but because she had decided long ago that the past would not be allowed to take even one more minute from a life that already had too little time. By 6 a.m, she was already at the copper kettle, tying on her apron, pinning up her hair, and putting on the calm, professional face a good waitress had to wear, pouring coffee, taking orders, wiping tables, smiling at regulars and strangers alike, all while a machine in her head never stopped running, adding and subtracting today's tips from this week's rent, from Poppy's medicine, from the follow-up appointment she had already postponed twice because she couldn't afford it. The morning shift manager, a man named Deacon, with a swollen belly and patience even thinner than the layer of butter he spread on toast, always found a reason to remind her that her position was fragile, constantly holding the threat of unemployment over her head to keep her submissive. And Ruby had learned to swallow those words along with her pride, because pride was a luxury a debt-burdened single mother could not always afford to pay for. But there was one small thing she refused to give up, though Deacon had forbidden it many times in the tone of a man who enjoyed the little power he had, and that was the black dog. She had first noticed it about 3 weeks earlier, a massive animal with scarred black fur prowling behind the diner in the pale edge of dawn, and while everyone else saw only a frightening stray that should have animal control called on it, Ruby saw something else. She saw the way it never attacked, the way it was gaunt down to the bones and still carried food somewhere else instead of devouring it on the spot, the way its eyes held a weariness she recognized immediately because she saw it in the mirror every morning. So each day, while clearing tables, she secretly wrapped up scraps of meat that were still good, pieces of bread customers had left behind, sometimes even an egg she quietly fried extra and paid for out of her own tips, then found a way to place them outside the back kitchen door, in the moment when Deacon wasn't watching. She didn't do it because she had kindness to spare, because she had nothing to spare at all, but because in that hungry dog outside, she saw a reminder that there was still one thing she could save, one life she could keep breathing, for one more day. Even when her little girl's fragile heart remained beyond the reach of the hands that had grown rough from carrying trays. This morning was the same. As she carried the coffee pot past the tables, she glanced quickly out the window in search of the dog's familiar shadow, and in that moment she also noticed the man sitting quietly in the corner booth by the glass, the man in the expensive gray suit that didn't belong here, the man whose cold coffee she had refilled, though he hadn't drunk any of it. There was something in his stillness that drew her attention, not because he was handsome or rich, but because she recognized in that unmoving posture the same thing she carried in her own chest, a loss held so tightly inside that it no longer had the shape of grief, and had instead become part of the structure of a person. She didn't know who he was, and a part of her, the part that had learned to fear silent, large men, warned her not to be curious. But another part of her, the part that still stubbornly believed people could be kind even when life gave them no reason to be, felt sorry for the man sitting alone on that freezing morning. She poured a little more hot coffee for him without saying anything, only gave him a slight nod, then turned away with the coffee pot and the endless list of things that needed doing, unaware that her fate, her daughter's fate, and the fate of that silent man were about to be bound tightly together by a black dog and something red that none of them could have foreseen. May Whitlock had stood behind the counter of the copper kettle for 32 years, long enough for her to believe there was no kind of person left who could walk through that glass door and still surprise her, and that belief had been carved into her face in wrinkles that were not born of bitterness, but of a calm steadiness forged through countless mornings exactly like this one. At 64, she still opened the diner herself every day before the sky had even begun to lighten, still lifted the heavy pots of soup with her own hands, still kept her silver hair twisted neatly at the nape of her neck and her glasses slipping low on the bridge of her nose so she could look over them whenever she wanted someone to understand she was speaking seriously. People in this Federal Street neighborhood called her the woman who wasn't afraid of anyone, and that was almost true. Except May wasn't a woman who didn't know fear. She had simply lived long enough to understand that there were things more frightening than dangerous men, such as becoming cowardly in the face of goodness, or turning away from a person who was drowning simply because looking straight at them was inconvenient. Her husband, Harold, had died behind this kitchen counter 10 years earlier from a heart attack in the middle of the lunch rush, and from that day on, May had run the diner alone, not because she needed the money, but because she believed that a place smelling of coffee and filled with the sound of people talking was one of the few things still keeping this neighborhood from falling apart completely. She knew who Vincenzo Falcone was. Of course she knew. A person couldn't live that many years in Providence without knowing what the name Falcone meant, without knowing that the man in the gray suit sitting by the corner window once a year could make the hardest men in the city lower their heads. But May treated him exactly the way she treated the old newspaper seller or the college girl who came in for cheap tea, with a blunt greeting, a full cup of coffee, and the right to sit quietly without being studied. She had learned long ago that every man, no matter how powerful, was only a soul hungry for something when he stepped into her diner, sometimes for food and sometimes for something much harder to name. That morning, she watched him from behind the counter, saw him lift the coffee cup and set it down again without drinking, saw the way his eyes stayed fixed on the window as though there were something outside only he could see, and May, who had sent off far too many men wearing that same face, understood that this was not an ordinary day for him. She picked up the coffee pot and walked over, unhurried, and poured more into his cup, though it was almost untouched. Then, in the hoarse voice worn down by the years, she said softly that some mornings were heavier than others, and a wise person knew how to sit still with that weight instead of pretending it didn't exist. Vince looked up at her, and in that moment something passed through his gray eyes, a defense that eased for a single flicker of time, because most people who stood in front of him either trembled or flattered him, while this silver-haired woman simply looked at him as though he were a human being. He didn't answer, but he also didn't coldly dismiss her, and for May, that was enough. She glanced toward Ruby, who was hurrying between the tables at the far end of the diner, then turned back and added, almost to herself, that the girl carried more on her shoulders than anyone her age ought to carry, and that May had lived long enough to know the people bearing the heaviest burdens were usually the ones least likely to set them down and ask anyone for help. Vince didn't ask why she was telling him that, and May didn't explain, because she wasn't the kind of person who believed kindness needed a clearly written reason. She simply dropped those words onto his table, the way someone dropped a seed into the earth, without needing to know whether it would ever sprout. She had seen the black dog outside the window, had seen Ruby secretly wrap up food for it, and though Deacon had reported it to her many times with the look of a man hoping she would punish someone, May had only waved him off and told him to mind his own work, because she would rather shelter a hungry dog behind the kitchen door than drive away the last decent part left in one of her employees. She didn't fully understand everything gathering around her little diner that morning. She didn't know about the red collar, didn't know what that dog was guarding, didn't know why the most powerful man in Providence was sitting motionless like a statue, and she didn't need to know, because May Whitlock had never believed it was her job to understand everything. She only believed it was her job to keep the lights on in the diner and the door open for anyone coming in from the cold. Before she went back to the counter, she rested her aged hand briefly on Vince's shoulder, a fleeting touch that he did not avoid, then told him that whatever might be waiting out there, inside these walls he was only a guest drinking coffee, and sometimes being allowed to be an ordinary person for one morning was already a gift not everyone knew how to value. Then she walked away, leaving her words suspended in the warm coffee-scented air, unaware that in only a few minutes, the thing waiting for Vince beyond that pane of glass would make everything he had thought he had buried rise again beneath the light of day. 3 days after that morning of remembrance, Vincenzo Falcone appeared again at the Copper Kettle, and he told himself it was because of business, that the Federal Street neighborhood lay within the family's reach, and that stopping by was nothing unusual, that he needed to keep an eye on a few matters tied to the harbor, and this diner just happened to be a convenient observation point. But even a man who had spent his life reading other people's lies knew perfectly well when he was lying to himself. The truth was that the red collar the black dog had dragged out of the trash that morning had lodged itself in his mind like a shard of broken glass, not large enough to kill him, but sharp enough to cut him every time he tried to forget it, and he had come back here not for business, but because he needed to see that dog again, needed to prove to himself that what he had seen was only an illusion born from the weight of a heavy mourning. He sat down at the same old table. Angela waited outside in the car as usual, and Vince ordered coffee in a low voice that made Deacon, the manager, hurry to bring it out himself, though normally he left that sort of thing to the staff. But what truly caught Vince's attention wasn't the coffee. It was the scene taking place in the hidden corner at the back, where through the narrow opening of the door leading down to the kitchen, he caught a glimpse of Ruby bending over, with a small paper bundle in her hand, secretive and quick as she set it down on the back step behind the door. And then the black dog stepped out from the shadows of the alley to take it with a caution that was almost solemn. He watched her do it with the kind of concentration he usually reserved for details other people overlooked, and he realized she didn't toss the food away the way people threw out trash. She placed it down. She stepped back so the animal wouldn't feel threatened. She did it all with a respect given to a living creature the rest of this city treated as something discarded. And for one brief moment, Vince felt something inside his chest shift, something he had kept locked tight for 6 years. Then everything broke open when Deacon found out. The man stormed into the kitchen, his shrill voice ringing loudly enough for half the diner to hear, scolding Ruby as someone who didn't know how to obey, reminding her again that he had forbidden her to feed that stray animal more times than he could count, saying she was dirtying the area behind the diner, attracting pests, giving the health inspector a reason to act. And then he let loose the sentence he always used like a blade, telling her she ought to remember there was a whole line of people out there ready to replace her, and that if she disobeyed him again, she could gather her things and go home that very day, without waiting for her shift to end. Ruby stood there with her back straight, but her hands clenched around her apron until her knuckles turned white, and Vince saw her swallow the answer rising in her throat, saw her weighing her pride against the job her little daughter depended on for every loose dollar, and he understood that she would choose silence, because the people carrying the heaviest burdens always learned that silence cost less than dignity. In that very moment, the cold, rational part of Vince reminded him that this was none of his business, that a boss didn't step in to handle petty matters between a waitress and a worthless little manager, that compassion was a luxury men like him could not reveal unless they wanted it turned into a weakness for others to exploit, and he had remained still for 6 years because of that very principle. But another part of him, the part May had unknowingly touched, the part the black dog had awakened, refused to sit still. Vince set his coffee cup down, rose to his feet, and walked toward the kitchen counter with the unhurried stride of a man who had never needed to rush, because the world had always slowed down around him on its own. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He only stopped close enough to Deacon for the man to feel the cold radiating from him. And then, in a voice so quiet Deacon had to hold his breath to hear it, he said he had just witnessed a devoted employee being humiliated for an act of kindness, and that he found it reflected very poorly on the way this diner was being run. Deacon started to sneer, started to ask who this stranger thought he was, but then he looked into Vince's eyes in time, and something in those gray eyes killed the words in his throat, made him suddenly remember the stories people still whispered about a man in a gray suit who shouldn't be angered. Vince went on, still gentle, saying that this girl would continue doing her job, that if the dog outside needed to eat, then it would eat, and that if Deacon had any problem with that, he could bring it directly to Vince, anytime, anywhere he wished. The manager went pale, stammered a few words, then backed away, and the entire kitchen sank into an awkward silence. Ruby looked up at Vince, and in her eyes there wasn't sweet gratitude, but a wariness mixed with confusion, because she had lived long enough to know that men who stepped in to help rarely did so without a price attached, and she had no intention of finding herself in debt to a stranger whose name she didn't even know. Vince read that in her eyes, and it didn't offend him. On the contrary, he respected it, because her guardedness showed him she was a woman who understood her own worth in a world always trying to price her too low. He said nothing more, gave no introduction, didn't linger to wait for thanks. He only gave her a slight nod and returned to his table, leaving Ruby standing silently behind him, while a troublesome question rose inside him that he couldn't push away. Why he, a man who had forbidden himself from becoming involved in anything that brought him no advantage, had just stepped out of his own armor because of a bundle of leftovers and a black dog he still didn't understand why mattered so much. That night, inside the mansion perched on the hill overlooking Providence Bay, Vincenzo Falcone stood beside the tall window with a glass of whiskey he never lifted to his lips, and for the first time in many years, he called Angelo into his private study to give him an assignment he knew would leave the young bodyguard confused. He didn't explain much. He only described the enormous black dog at the copper kettle, and more importantly, he described the red leather collar it had dragged out of the trash, the red faded by time, the cracks in the leather, the brass buckle gone dull, and he ordered Angelo to find out where that dog had come from, who it belonged to, and how that collar had ended up in the trash behind a diner on Federal Street. Angelo accepted the order without asking questions, as he always did, but after he had left, Vince remained standing there for a very long time, because he couldn't tell Angelo the part that had truly kept him from sleeping, the part even Vince himself didn't dare say aloud, which was that he recognized that collar. Memory, the thing he had spent all those painful years locking behind steel doors inside his mind, now came flooding back without permission, dragging him backward to the years when the name Falcone had not yet carried fear with it, when he and his younger brother had still been two scrawny boys growing up in a cold apartment, with a father who was often absent in both body and spirit. In that childhood, deprived of almost everything, there had been one winter when the two brothers found an abandoned puppy in the alley behind their building, a tiny Neapolitan Mastiff with black fur and paws too large for its body, trembling and nearly dead from the cold, and his younger brother, only 7 years old then, had insisted on bringing it home, even though Vince knew that feeding one more mouth was madness for two children who barely had enough to feed themselves. They named him Duke, and by some miracle only children can manage, they kept him alive, sharing every scrap of food with him, hiding him from their father, warming him with their own body heat through winter nights. And Duke grew into a massive animal so loyal that he would gladly stand between the two boys and any danger that came too close. It was his younger brother who had braided a collar for Duke with his own hands from a piece of red leather he had found, clumsy and rough, but tied together with all the love a poor child could give. And he had been so proud of that collar that even after Duke grew old and died years later, he still kept it like a treasure, carrying it with him through all the years of adulthood, even when the two brothers stepped into the underworld and became entirely different men. Vince remembered very clearly that the red collar was always in his brother's coat pocket, a fragment of the innocence they had both lost, a reminder that there had once been a time when they had known how to love something without weighing the cost. And that was what made his blood go cold when the dog at the diner dragged that red collar into the daylight, because the last time Vince had seen it was on the most terrible night of his life, the night he lost his younger brother, and among everything he believed with certainty about that night, there was one thing he had never doubted, that the collar had disappeared with his brother, had been buried forever with the body he had not reached in time to save. So how, after all these years, had it appeared in the mouth of a stray dog behind a shabby diner miles from the cemetery, and how had a black Neapolitan Mastiff, the same breed as Duke, with that same enormous build and those same sorrowful eyes, become the one to bring it back on the exact anniversary of his brother's death, to the exact window where Vince sat in remembrance? Vince didn't believe in coincidence. His entire life in this business had taught him that coincidence was the word naive people used for schemes they had not yet learned to see, and every fiber of his body told him this red collar had not drifted back here by accident, that some hand, some story, some truth buried for 6 years, was trying to claw its way back to the surface through that animal. He thought of the dog's eyes staring straight at him through the glass, eyes that did not belong to a hungry animal begging for food, but to something with a purpose, as if it knew exactly what it was carrying and who it was bringing it to, and the thought made a man whose hand had never shaken before the barrel of a gun shudder. He set the glass of whiskey down, looked out at the black water of the bay beneath the city lights, and for the first time in 6 years his iron belief about what had happened on the night his brother died, the version of the story he had used to torment himself and define himself all this time, began to show a crack as thin as a strand of hair, and he knew, with the fear of a man about to face the thing he had spent the longest time running from, that once Angelo started digging, there would be no way back. Vince returned to the copper kettle more often in the days that followed, and though he still wrapped it in the disguise of business, the truth was that he was waiting for two things at once: news from Angelo about the red collar, and those brief moments when he could observe the woman with the wary eyes. He wasn't a man easily made curious about other people. His whole life had taught him to see human beings as chess pieces or threats, but Ruby didn't fit into either pattern, and that unsettled him in a way he wouldn't admit. Through scattered pieces of conversation he overheard, through the way May occasionally let a stray sentence fall, through his own watching, he gradually put together the picture of her life, of the little daughter named Poppy with an imperfect heart, of the surgery carrying a price no waitress could ever reach, of the husband who had walked away and left debts behind, and every piece of it made something inside him ache in a way he had thought he had lost the ability to feel. One late afternoon, when the diner was almost empty, he called her over and, in the careful voice of a man unaccustomed to expressing himself, he suggested that he knew a few excellent doctors, that he could help her daughter receive proper examinations, that money didn't have to be a problem. He had thought she would feel relieved, even grateful, because in his world every problem disappeared in front of money, and everyone had a price. But Ruby only straightened her back, set the coffee pot down, and looked at him with an expression he hadn't expected. Not fear, not submission, but a fury held back beneath a thin layer of politeness. She said softly that she didn't know who he was and didn't want to know, that she had met enough men who liked handing out kindness only to make her pay for it later, that her daughter wasn't a debt of gratitude for her to trade for the pity of a stranger in an expensive suit. She said she would take care of Poppy herself, even if she had to work 3 jobs instead of 2, even if she had to go without eating more often, and that the only thing she asked of him was not to look at her, as though she were someone to be pitied, because pity was the one thing she didn't have the strength to accept and still remain herself. Vince fell silent before those words, and instead of anger at being refused, something no one in Providence dared do to him, he felt a respect rise in him so forcefully that it surprised him. She wasn't a victim waiting to be saved. She was a woman fighting an unequal war, while still stubbornly clutching her dignity like her last weapon, and that very stubbornness, that refusal to let herself be valued too low, touched something in him far more deeply than any thank you ever could. He didn't insist, didn't impose. He only nodded slightly and said he understood, that he would never look at her that way again, and perhaps that was the kindest thing he could give her, respect instead of pity. Between two people who belonged to worlds that could not have been farther apart, an invisible thread of tension had formed, an attraction held back by countless barriers, by her past and his present, by secrets neither of them was ready to lay bare. But that very night, when Vince left the diner and stepped into the car, Angelo turned back from the driver's seat with a face more tense than usual, and what he reported made the air inside the car freeze solid. Angelo said he had followed the dog's trail, and what he found was nowhere near as simple as a stray animal that had wandered off, because that black Neapolitan Mastiff carried scars that did not come from accidents, but from fights, cuts, and clumsy stitching characteristic of dogs raised for fighting, and every clue he had gathered led back to a name in the underworld that even the Falcone family knew well, a man named Garrett Voss, who ran some of the darkest operations in the city, including an underground dog fighting ring the police had failed to uncover for many years. Vince listened and felt his blood grow cold, because if the dog belonged to Voss's operation, then its appearance at the copper kettle, with his brother's red collar, could no longer be explained as coincidence in any way, but had begun to take the shape of something deliberate, a black thread connecting his buried past to a dangerous present he had not yet fully seen. Angelo asked whether his boss wanted him to dig deeper, and Vince, his eyes still fixed on the darkness of the street where the black dog had vanished, only nodded slightly, though a part of him already sensed that every step closer to the truth was also one step pulling that stubborn woman and her little girl closer to a danger they knew absolutely nothing about. The next morning, a curiosity Ruby couldn't extinguish drew her after the black dog, once it accepted the bundle of food from her hand, because for weeks she had wondered why an animal so hungry. It was all Bones had never once eaten on the spot, but always carried the food away somewhere. And that morning, before her shift had even begun, and while the alley behind the diner was still sunk in cold fog, she quietly followed that enormous black shadow through the cramped turns between the old buildings. The dog did not know it was being followed, or perhaps it did know and had judged her to be no danger, and it led her to a hidden corner deep inside the alley, where a narrow gap between two brick walls had been covered by a few rotting wooden planks and a torn tarp. Ruby stopped, her heart pounding, and what she saw when the dog slipped inside made her hold her breath, because there, curled up on a heap of rags and cardboard that the big dog had been dragging back for days, was a tiny puppy, gaunt and weak to the point that it could barely move, a small life gasping its way through the cold. The enormous black dog, the creature this whole city feared and called a dangerous stray, lowered itself beside the puppy with a tenderness that nearly made Ruby cry. It gently licked the little one's thin fur, nudged the scraps of food it had just carried back toward the tiny mouth that was too weak to chew, and lay down to wrap the puppy in the warmth of its scarred body. In that single moment, every judgment Ruby had ever had, every fear the whole neighborhood had placed on this animal, dissolved, because she understood that the black dog had never dug through trash out of greed or wildness. It had dug through trash to feed its baby. It had carried every scrap of food through the freezing streets not out of selfish survival instinct, but out of a fierce motherhood so powerful that it would rather go hungry to keep its fading child alive for one more day. The dog wasn't vicious. It was guarding, and the scars crisscrossing its body, the marks of a brutal past Ruby did not yet fully understand, no longer looked to her like signs of a dangerous beast, but like proof of a living creature that had endured too much and still had not lost its ability to love. But that tender moment was cut short by a sound at the mouth of the alley, and Ruby turned just in time to see two strange men step in, men with rough bodies and the cold eyes of people accustomed to violence. And the moment they came closer, the black dog sprang up from beside the puppy with astonishing speed and stood between the two men and the little nest where its baby lay. It didn't bark wildly. It only lowered its body and released a deep, guttural growl from far inside its chest, a clear warning that if they wanted to reach its baby, they would have to step over its body first. One of the men cursed, pulled out an iron bar, and in the chaos that happened too quickly for Ruby to react, the black dog lunged forward to block the blow, when the other man swung something sharp toward the nest, taking the full strike in its own side to protect its puppy. Ruby screamed, an instinctive scream that echoed through the narrow alley, and perhaps that very scream saved all of them, because the two men froze when they realized there was a witness, glanced at each other, then quickly withdrew into the darkness, leaving behind the black dog staggering with a bleeding wound in its side, and the puppy still gasping among the rags. Ruby stepped forward, trembling, and for the first time, that enormous animal did not growl a warning at her. It only looked at her with sorrowful eyes full of pain, as though after everything that had just happened, it understood that this woman was not an enemy. Then it collapsed beside its baby, using the last of its strength to keep shielding that tiny life even while it was bleeding. Ruby knelt in the cold alley, tears rolling down her face, and she knew she could not leave them here, could not let the dog that had risked itself to protect its child die in this corner. And in her panic, she could think of only one person, the man in the gray suit with gray eyes and a power she had only just rejected the day before. The only person she believed might have enough reach to help her save these two lives before the sky fully brightened. Ruby's call came just before 7 o'clock, and though she only had the diner's number and not his, it was May who quietly connected them, because the old diner owner had read something in Vince's eyes over the past few days, and knew he was the only person who could act quickly. Less than 20 minutes later, Falcone's black car was parked at the mouth of the alley, and Vince and Angelo stepped out, and when Vincent saw the scene in that hidden corner, the enormous black dog lying limp with blood seeping from its side, while still trying to shield a fading puppy with its own body, something inside his chest tightened until he could barely breathe. He didn't say much. He only ordered Angelo to call a name the family still trusted whenever wounds needed treating, but could not be taken to an ordinary hospital. Dr. Nadine Ellison, a woman in her 40s who ran a discreet clinic on the edge of the city, and was known in the underworld for two things: exceptional skill and a mouth that knew how to stay shut. They carried both dogs to her in Vince's blanket, and Nadine, though accustomed to strange cases, still raised an eyebrow when she saw one of the most powerful men in Providence personally carrying a scarred stray dog into her clinic at daybreak. She went to work at once, stitching the wound along the big dog's side, giving fluids and warmth to the exhausted puppy, and throughout it all, Vince stood silently in the corner, his hand clenched tight, his eyes never leaving the animal, while Ruby sat curled into a plastic chair, with both hands still trembling. Two strangers bound together in a brightly lit room while the city had not yet awakened. Once the big dog had passed the critical point and drifted into sleep under the medicine, Nadine took out the scanner she usually used to check for identification chips, a routine procedure with any ownerless animal, and ran it along the black dog's neck without much hope, because fighting dogs were rarely chipped. But the device gave a soft beep, and a few numbers appeared on the screen, an old chip, the kind that had been outdated for many years. And when Nadine looked up that number in the private records she kept, the expression on her face changed in a way that made Vince alert at once. She turned to him, her voice careful, and said this dog was not an ordinary fighting dog taken from the streets, that its chip showed it came from a traceable bloodline, carefully recorded, a purebred Neapolitan Mastiff line passed down through several generations, and the strange thing was that the record led back to a name, and an address from more than 2 decades earlier, a line from which the animal lying here was a descendant. Vince stepped closer to the screen, and when his eyes moved over the lines of information, his heart seemed to stop, because in that bloodline record there was mention of an ancestor dog, a black male that had once belonged to a poor neighborhood he knew down to every brick. And the name written beside it, though blurred by years of copied data, was a name he had never forgotten: Duke. Nadine, unaware of the meaning of what she had just discovered, went on to say that valuable bloodlines like this usually had an identifying object attached to them, a special collar or a distinctive tag, and she asked whether the dog had been found with anything like that, because it would help confirm its origin. Vince slowly reached into the inner pocket of his coat and took out the red leather collar he had kept with him for the past several days. The faded, cracked collar the dog had dragged out of the trash, and he placed it on the examination table beneath the white light. Nadine picked it up, examined the dulled brass buckle and the clumsy stitching, then compared it against a few notes in the record, and she nodded in confirmation that yes, this handmade collar style completely matched the period and the recorded bloodline, that this was almost certainly the original identifying object connected to that line of dogs. Ruby looked at Vince, unable to understand why his usually composed face had gone pale as though he had seen a ghost, unable to understand why the hand holding the red collar trembled slightly, and Vince couldn't explain, because inside his mind there was only one question screaming now, a question whose answer he feared more than anything, which was that if this collar was truly his brother's collar, the thing he had believed had been buried forever on the fateful night 6 years earlier, then how could it have survived? And more importantly, who had kept it all these years? And why had it now returned to him through the offspring of the very dog from his childhood, like a message from the grave he wasn't ready to read? The red collar had opened a door Vince could no longer close, and when he assigned Angelo to dig deeper into Garrett Voss's operation, he did not expect what they found to lead back into the very heart of his own empire. For days, Angelo quietly followed the money flowing through the family's hidden accounts, numbers that should have been touched only by the few most trusted people, and what he discovered forced him to check and recheck it many times before he dared bring it to his boss. There were expenditures that did not match, small streams of money withdrawn, and then skillfully concealed under the name of harbor operating costs, transactions routed through front companies that belonged to the family on paper, but in reality flowed into places Angelo could not trace. The amount was not large enough to raise an immediate alarm, and that was exactly what made it dangerous, because whoever stood behind it was wise enough to take only a little at a time, patient enough to bleed the empire slowly without anyone noticing, and familiar enough with the internal system to know exactly where to hide it. Angelo presented everything to Vince inside the sealed study, and when he reached the part about those murky transactions all passing through a single link, one person with enough authority to approve them without being questioned, both men fell silent, because the name that appeared was not an outsider's, but Cormac Doyle's, Vince's right-hand man for nearly 15 years, the 44-year-old man who had walked with the family since its earliest days, and had always been regarded as the living embodiment of loyalty. Vince did not want to believe it, and his first reaction was to reject it, because Cormac had stood beside him through the fiercest battles, had stood next to him at his younger brother's funeral, with a face heavy with grief, had proven many times that he was willing to take risks for his boss. To suspect a man like that was no different from cutting off his own arm, and Vince understood clearly that in his world, paranoia could kill an organization just as quickly as betrayal, that there had been bosses who destroyed their own empires with their own hands simply because they saw enemies everywhere they looked. But Angelo, with the caution of a man who knew he was stepping onto thin ice, reminded his boss of a string of small details that seemed harmless when standing, alone but formed a troubling shape when fitted together. The times Cormac had been absent at moments that were difficult to explain, the meetings he had not fully reported, the internal information that should only have been known inside the trusted circle, but had somehow leaked to rival crews in recent months, causing several losses the family had until now blamed on bad luck. Vince sat in silence for a long time after Angelo finished speaking, his gaze drifting toward the window overlooking the bay, and inside his mind a cold defensive mechanism began to operate, the very mechanism that had helped him survive all these years in a world where trust was the most expensive luxury of all. He did not order action, did not confront anyone, did not reveal even the slightest sign that he knew, because he understood that if Cormac truly was the traitor, the worst possible move now would be to let him realize he was under suspicion, and if Cormac was innocent, a reckless accusation could permanently shatter a relationship built by blood and time. Instead, he told Angelo to keep watching in silence, gather more evidence, and absolutely not let anyone else in the organization know about this investigation, not even those closest to them, because now Vince no longer knew for certain whom he could trust. But what unsettled him most was not the numbers or the streams of money, but a faint connection beginning to take shape in his mind, a black thread linking the name Cormac Doyle to the name Garrett Voss, linking his empire to the dark dogfighting operation that had scarred the animal carrying his brother's red collar back to him. And though he could not yet prove it, though everything was still a scattering of separate pieces that had not locked into place, the instinct sharpened through an entire lifetime told him that these seemingly unrelated events were all pointing in one direction he did not yet dare look at directly. He thought of the night 6 years earlier, of the moment he still blamed himself for hesitating, and for the first time, a thought cold enough to chill. His spine slipped into his mind, a thought he quickly pushed away because it was too terrible to hold, that perhaps the story he had always believed about that night was incomplete, that perhaps there was a hand hidden in the darkness of that memory that he had never considered. He did not know the truth yet, and he told himself he must not rush toward a conclusion. But when he rose from his desk that night, for the first time in many years, Vincenzo Falcone felt the solid foundation of the empire he had built tremble faintly beneath his feet, and he was no longer certain whether his most dangerous enemy was standing outside the gate, or had long been sitting inside the family dining room. Although Ruby had firmly rejected his kindness, Vince was not the kind of man who easily let go of something once he had made up his mind. And after that morning in Nadine's clinic, when he had watched her kneel in the cold alley and still refused to abandon the 2 dogs, he quietly did something he knew she would never have allowed if he had asked. He had someone contact the hospital where Poppy was waiting on the surgery list, and through the discreet channels that only money and power could open, he arranged for the entire cost of the little girl's heart operation to be paid, but he did it under a name that was not his own, disguising it as an anonymous fund for sick children, a charitable program that did not exist in any newspaper, built solely so no one could trace it back to him. He did not do it to buy her gratitude, because from the moment she refused him, he had understood that gratitude was not something she could give away without losing a part of herself. He did it for a reason simpler and harder to admit, because the thought that a child might die, only because her mother did not have enough money, was something even a man as accustomed to death as he was could not sit still and endure. But secrets, even the most carefully hidden ones, always found a way to leak into the light, and a few days later, When Ruby received the call from the hospital telling her that Poppy's surgery had been fully funded and that the little girl could be scheduled for the operation as soon as possible, she stood frozen in the middle of the diner with the phone pressed to her ear, unable to believe what she had just heard. The joy that burst open inside her lasted only a moment before it was replaced by a chilling question. Because she had not applied to any charity, had not submitted a request to any program, and in the whole hard course of her life, she had learned that good things did not simply fall from the sky without someone standing behind them. She questioned the hospital, ran into carefully built walls of information, but the instinct of a woman far too used to needing to be on guard led her to the only name with enough power and enough reason to do this. And when she faced Vince in the diner late one afternoon, her eyes did not shine with gratitude, but burned with something far more complicated. She asked him directly whether he was the one behind it, and when he did not deny it, did not make excuses, but only looked at her in silence, she felt two opposing currents tearing through her so violently that she began to tremble. One part of her wanted to fall to her knees and thank the man who had just saved her daughter's life, wanted to weep from relief after so many sleepless nights haunted by that enormous number. But another part, the part that had been hurt too many times by men who gave favors only to demand repayment many times over, felt deeply insulted because he had crossed the line she had drawn, had made a decision for her about her own life, had turned her into someone in debt without ever asking her consent. She told him, her voice choking between anger and gratitude, that he had no right, that she had told him she would take care of it herself. That did he have any idea what it felt like to spend a whole life holding out your hand to others, and how much that could wear a person down. Vince let her say everything, did not interrupt, did not defend himself, and only when she had run out of words did he answer, softly and sincerely in the way he rarely allowed himself to reveal, that he had not done it because he pitied her, that he had never seen her as someone pathetic, that he had done it because the little girl deserved to live, and because sometimes letting a life die when you could have stopped it was a sin heavier than offending someone's pride. He added that he did not need her thanks, did not need her to owe him anything, that if it made her feel better, she could consider this a debt he owed his own conscience, not a debt she owed him. There was something in that voice, a rare and naked honesty, that touched her in a way no pretty words could have done, and in the silence that fell between them, for the first time, Ruby truly looked into his gray eyes, not with wariness, but with the first fragile stirrings of understanding. She realized that the man standing before her was carrying a wound of his own, one perhaps no smaller than hers, a loss that had taught him that saving a life mattered more than saving face. She did not thank him, because they both understood that thank you would ruin the fragile moment, so she only gave a slight nod, a nod carrying everything she could not say aloud, then turned away and quickly wiped the corner of her eye, and Vince, standing there watching her go, felt something he had not allowed himself to feel for 6 years, a fragile and dangerous warmth, an invisible thread tightening between him and this woman and her little girl, without knowing yet that this very thread would soon become the thing his hidden enemy would try to exploit. That night, Vince didn't sleep, and in the stillness of the mansion on the hill, the memory he'd spent 6 years imprisoning broke loose again and marched through his mind with its familiar cruelty, because his younger brother Tommy, whose full name was Thomas Falcone, had died on a cold November night inside an abandoned warehouse near the harbor, and Vince had been there, only a few steps away from him, when everything fell apart. In the version of the story he'd told himself over and over until it became part of the structure of who he was, everything had happened like this. The family had been locked in a tense negotiation with a rival crew, and a meeting had been arranged at that warehouse to settle the conflict. A meeting Tommy, with his eagerness and his faith in his older brother, had insisted on attending even though Vince had wanted him to stay home. The negotiation turned into a trap, gunfire erupted from the darkness, and in that chaos Vince remembered seeing a gun barrel aimed at Tommy, remembered seeing his younger brother standing exposed with nowhere to hide, and in that deciding moment between life and death, he'd hesitated. Only 1 second, one brief moment he couldn't ever forgive himself for, one instant when his hand had been slower than his will, when he'd frozen instead of firing at once, and in that fateful second the shot had rung out, and Tommy had fallen onto the cold concrete floor, with the surprise still not gone from his eyes. Vince had fired back afterward, had killed the men he believed were responsible, had held his brother's body in his arms amid the spreading pool of blood, and screamed a sound he could still hear on his worst nights. But all of it had come too late, and he'd walked out of that warehouse that night as another man, a man who decided that if hesitation could kill the person he loved most, then he'd never allow himself to hesitate again, that he'd become as cold and decisive as a machine, that tenderness was a luxury whose price was paid in lives. That was the story he believed, and it had shaped every decision he'd made ever since, turning him into the boss all of Providence feared, a man who never paused, never let emotion interfere with judgment, never forgave weakness in himself or in anyone else. But tonight, after everything that had happened, after the red collar and the dog, and the suspicious streams of money leading back to Cormac, that memory appeared in a different shade. And for the first time, Vince allowed himself to examine it, not as a sentence he'd passed on himself, but as a scene that needed to be investigated. There were details he hadn't allowed himself to stop and think about for 6 years. Small fragments buried beneath the weight of grief and guilt, and now they began to rise and demand attention. He remembered that the meeting that night had been arranged by someone on the inside, that the details of the place and time had been known only to a very narrow circle, that the enemy had known exactly where they'd be and when they'd arrive, as if someone had warned them in advance. He remembered that amid the chaos, something hadn't fit, a vague sense that the shot that killed Tommy hadn't come from the direction it should have come from. But at the time he'd been drowning in shock and rage, so he'd pushed that feeling aside and accepted the simplest version, that it was an ambush by the enemy, and that the fault belonged to his own delay. He remembered the red collar had always been in Tommy's coat pocket, and he remembered that after that night, when people cleaned up the scene and handled the funeral arrangements, he'd never seen that collar again, and he'd assumed it had been lost in the chaos, had told himself it had been buried with his brother, without once asking whether someone might have taken it. The more Vince turned over each detail, the more he felt a cold unease rising inside him, because the story he'd believed all these years, the story he'd used to punish and define himself, suddenly had too many gaps, too many questions that had never been asked. He still didn't dare name what he was beginning to suspect, still tried to cling to the old version, because at least in that version he knew who the guilty man was. And that man was himself, while if that version was wrong, it meant he'd spent 6 years tormenting himself for a sin that wasn't entirely his. And worse, it meant the person who truly killed his brother was still alive, still moving freely somewhere, maybe even very close. He looked out over the black water of the bay in the night and clenched the red collar in his palm until the brass buckle pressed into his flesh, and he knew he couldn't turn away from these questions anymore, no matter if the answers might destroy everything he thought. He understood about the night that had taken half his soul. Across the city, inside a dark office above a warehouse under the family's control, Cormac Doyle stood by the window, looking down at the stream of traffic, and for the first time in many years, he felt something he had almost forgotten the sensation of: fear. For nearly 15 years he had played the loyal man perfectly, had polished the image of a devoted right hand until even the most suspicious men no longer looked at him with questioning eyes. And throughout all that time he had patiently bled the empire bit by bit, built hidden alliances, moved each piece into place for the day when he would seize what he had always believed should have belonged to him. But now, through the eyes and ears he had planted throughout the organization, he had begun to hear noises that unsettled him, news that Vince had people investigating a dog, news of a red leather collar, and those 3 words alone, red leather collar, were enough to turn his spine cold, because he was the only man still alive who knew exactly what that collar meant and why its appearance was a deadly threat to him. He had thought that chapter had been closed forever 6 years earlier, had thought every trace had been erased, and the fact that the collar had somehow survived and returned at this exact moment made him realize there was one loose thread he had failed to tie off, one small mistake from the past now threatening to pull down the entire structure he had worked so hard to build. Cormac understood Vince better than most people did, understood that once the boss began pulling at a thread, he wouldn't stop until the whole spool came undone, and he knew that if Vince uncovered the truth behind that collar, There wouldn't be a dark corner on earth that could hide him from the fury that would come crashing down. So he decided he had to act first, had to sever every connection that might lead Vince to the truth. And that meant he had to deal with the dog that had carried the collar, and anyone who had been involved in bringing it back into the light. He went to Garrett Voss, the boss of the dog-fighting operation he had been secretly tied to for a long time. A dark alliance even Vince had never suspected, and in a private meeting between two men both accustomed to treating other people's lives like numbers in a ledger, they discussed how to extinguish the threat. Voss was already furious because the black dog was one of the valuable animals that had escaped from his fighting ring, and the fact that it had not only escaped but had drawn Falcone's attention made him see it as a double threat that needed to be eliminated at once. But Cormac, with his characteristic cold calculation, understood that killing the dog alone wouldn't be enough, because now there were people who knew about it. There was the woman at the diner who had secretly fed it and had seen too much, and worst of all, Vince himself seemed to have taken an unusual interest in her and her little daughter, a weakness a boss like Vince hadn't exposed in 6 years. With the instinct of a predator, Cormac immediately recognized that the woman was exactly the leverage he needed, that if he could seize something Vince cared about, he could control the next move, could lure the boss into a trap of his own making, and could end the threat called the Red Collar at the same time he cleared the path for the takeover he had waited far too long to attempt. He didn't tell Voss his entire plan, only revealed enough for the dog-fighting boss to see his own benefit in it, because Cormac was a man who never laid all his cards on the table, not even with an ally, and inside his mind a chain of dark moves was already being arranged, each step calculated to leave no trail leading back to him. He ordered his men to begin watching the woman from the copper kettle, to record her schedule, her habits, her connections, and especially everything related to the little daughter waiting for heart surgery. And as he gave those cold orders, Cormac's face showed not the slightest flicker of emotion, because to him, Ruby and Poppy weren't people at all, only pieces on a board, tools to be used for a purpose, names that could be erased once they were no longer useful. Outside the window, the city of Providence continued moving in its careless way. Ordinary people passing beneath the streetlights, never knowing that in the darkness above them, a trap was being set, a trap whose cords were about to tighten around a single mother, a child with a sick heart, a loyal dog, and a boss who was closer than ever to a truth his hidden enemy was willing to kill to bury forever. In the days that followed, a vague unease began to seep into every corner of life around the copper kettle, like the heavy stillness settling over the ground just before a storm breaks. Angelo was the first to feel it clearly, because his quiet investigation into Cormac had begun to run into walls, leads suddenly sealed off, familiar sources abruptly going silent, and he realized with a chill along his spine that someone inside the organization knew they were digging, and was actively erasing traces faster than they could follow them. He brought that worry to Vince, warning his boss that their investigation might have been exposed, that the insider not only existed, but was now watching them in return, and that meant every move from this point forward had to be calculated, as though an invisible pair of eyes were staring at them from the dark. Vince received the warning with outward calm, but inside he knew Angelo was right, and the survival instinct sharpened over an entire lifetime told him that the situation was moving into a far more dangerous phase, that his hidden enemy had sensed the threat, and once an animal was driven into a corner, it became most dangerous. At the same time, at Nadine's clinic where the black dog was slowly recovering from its wound, the animal itself sensed something people had not yet seen. It grew unusually restless, its ears lifting tensely at every strange sound, its eyes often turning toward the door, with the vigilance of a creature that had learned in its blood that this world was always hiding dangers in wait. It growled softly in the night even when no one approached, stood guard in front of its puppy's nest whenever a shadow passed through the hallway, and Nadine, who had seen enough animals in her life, understood that this dog's instincts were warning of something, and she quietly let Vince know about the change. But the one who felt most clearly the dark shadow closing around her was Ruby herself, though she couldn't name it. She began to notice small things that made her skin prickle: an unfamiliar car parked too long across the street from the diner at different hours, a man she had never seen before who seemed to appear at the corner whenever she got off work, that crawling feeling at the back of her neck as if someone were watching her from behind, though every time she turned, she saw nothing but the nameless flow of people. At first, she told herself it was only the paranoia of a woman too used to being on guard, the echo of years spent living in fear beside her former husband, but the feeling didn't fade. It grew thicker every day, and the mother's instinct inside her began to scream its warning, making her tighten her grip on Poppy's hand every time she led her across the street, making her look over her shoulder again and again on the walk home. She mentioned that fear to May, and the old diner owner, who never missed anything that happened in her neighborhood, had also noticed strange faces drifting around the diner in recent days. And though she didn't say everything she was thinking because she didn't want to frighten the girl, her eyes darkened with the vigilance of someone who knew something bad was drawing near. When those separate fragments of worry were pieced together and reached Vince, he didn't hesitate anymore, because by then he understood that what was happening wasn't coincidence, that his enemy had shifted from defense to attack, and that the woman and little girl he had accidentally pulled into his orbit were now standing directly in the path of the storm. He immediately tightened security, quietly assigning his own men, the ones he could still trust after removing the circle connected to Cormac, to watch the copper kettle and protect Ruby and Poppy from a distance without letting her notice, while also strengthening the guard around Nadine's clinic, where the two dogs were being kept hidden. He instructed every man to be twice as alert, to report every unusual thing no matter how small, and he kept the red collar with him at all times as a reminder that this game was no longer about the past but had become a war in the present, a war in which, if he fell even one heartbeat behind, innocent people might have to pay the price. But even with all that caution, even with every sense in him pulled tight as he waited for the coming strike, Vince still couldn't imagine that his enemy was already one step ahead, that the trap had been set and was waiting for the right moment to snap shut, and that the tense stillness covering all of them in those days was nothing but the last breath before the true storm roared. The storm struck on a Thursday evening, fast and merciless in exactly the way Cormac had calculated, exploiting the one narrow gap in the protection Vince had built around them. That afternoon, Poppy came down with a slight fever, and Ruby, worried for her daughter's fragile heart, left the diner earlier than usual to take the little girl home, breaking the familiar routine Vince's men had been relying on to keep watch. That was all it took, one small change in habit, one moment when the two guards had not yet adjusted their positions, and Voss's men had been waiting for precisely that opening. When Ruby carried Poppy into the alley leading to the back door of their apartment building, an unmarked van rolled up. Its door flew open, and before she could scream or run, rough hands dragged both mother and child into the darkness of the cargo hold. Ruby fought back with every ounce of strength a mother had, clawing, kicking, screaming her daughter's name. But there were too many of them, and they were too strong. And the only thing she managed to do was wrap Poppy tightly in her arms, shielding the child with her own body from the blows and jolts as the van roared away. The little girl shrieked in her mother's arms, her small face going pale from terror and from the weak heart beating wildly inside her chest, and Ruby, in the middle of that horror, could only whisper into her ear the words of comfort she herself didn't believe, that everything would be all right, that Mommy was here, that Mommy wouldn't let anyone hurt her. Vince's two guards discovered what had happened only minutes after it was done. Too late to stop it, but soon enough to raise the alarm at once. And the terrible news reached Vince like a knife driven through his chest. But the one thing Cormac and Voss had not counted on, the single link they had underestimated in their entire cruel plan, was the black dog. At Nadine's clinic not far away, the animal that had been restless for days suddenly went wild at that fateful moment, as if an invisible thread connecting it to the woman who had saved it and sat beside it, on the night it was wounded, had been violently pulled tight. It thrashed, its eyes blazing with a fierce light, and despite the wound in its side that hadn't fully healed, despite the stitches still pulling at its flesh, it threw itself against the clinic door with a force Nadine couldn't hold back, smashed the latch open, and bolted into the night. It left behind even its puppy, the baby it had nearly died protecting, and that alone showed that its instinct was telling it another life was in danger, a debt of devotion this loyal creature couldn't ignore. The black dog tore through the cold streets of Providence, its enormous shadow flashing beneath the streetlights, its nose pressed to the ground as it followed a trail only it could sense, crossing intersections, slipping through traffic, never slowing even as blood began seeping again from its side, where the old wound had been torn open by this frantic effort. It didn't run toward the place where Ruby had been taken, because an instinct deeper than tracking had led it to another choice. To the man it had stared at through the glass on that fateful morning, the man to whom it had delivered the red collar like a message, the only man it believed had the power to save the woman in danger. At the same time, at the mansion on the hill, Vince was shouting into the phone, mobilizing every resource, trying to hold back the panic rising inside him with the cold discipline of a commander, as Angelo reported that Ruby and Poppy were missing, and that every trace led back to Voss. It was in that desperate moment, as Vince stood in the great hall, with his heart twisting under the familiar terror of a man about to lose something precious before he could save it, the feeling that had haunted him for 6 years, that a furious scratching sounded outside the gate, followed by the hoarse, desperate bark of an animal at the edge of collapse. He rushed out, and under the gate lights he saw the black dog standing there, trembling, blood spread across its side, its front legs buckling from exhaustion. But its eyes lifted straight to him, with an urgency that could not be mistaken. A look Vince understood instantly, because it reflected that morning in the diner, only this time everything had been reversed. This time the dog had not brought him a question from the past, but a plea from the present, a desperate cry that the woman who had saved it now needed them to save her, right now, before it was too late. Vince knelt before the black dog in the cold of the entryway, and in that moment, time seemed to stop, because the look passing between them now carried a weight he felt all the way down to his bones. On that morning of remembrance many weeks earlier, this very animal had looked at him through the diner glass, a gaze from the outside looking in, a silent question thrown toward the man sitting the warmth with a cold cup of coffee. And back then he had been the one sheltered while the dog had stood outside in the freezing cold. Now everything had turned completely around. There was no glass left between them. No distance between the watcher and the one being watched, only a man and an animal both kneeling on the cold ground, and this time it was the dog that had come to him, the dog that had crossed half the city with blood seeping from its wound to place before him, not a question but a plea. Vince looked into those eyes, those sorrowful eyes now burning with urgency, and he understood something that made his chest tighten, that this animal had left behind the very puppy it had nearly died protecting, had torn open its own wound, had poured out the last of its failing strength to run here, not for itself, but because another life was in danger. If a dog, a creature this whole city had despised and called a stray beast, could push aside both physical pain and the instinct to protect its own young, in order to beg for help for the woman who had shown it kindness, then what reason did he, a human being, have left to hesitate? And that very word, hesitate, struck him like a knife, because it dragged him back to the night in the warehouse, to the fateful 1-second moment he'd blamed himself for through 6 years, the instant when hesitation had stolen Tommy from his hands. He realized with icy clarity that this was the moment his entire life since that night had prepared him for. Once again, a life he treasured was hanging at the edge of the abyss. Once again, a few seconds could decide life or death, and this time he swore to himself that he wouldn't freeze, wouldn't let fear or calculation slow his hand, wouldn't let history repeat itself as a second tragedy. The dog, as though sensing the resolve that had just formed inside the man before it, tried to rise on trembling legs, turned its head toward the direction from which it had come, and looked back at him as if urging him on, as if saying there was no more time to kneel here. Vince placed his hand on its huge scarred head, a gesture that was both a promise and an understanding between two beings who had both suffered loss and both knew what it meant to risk themselves for another life. Then he rose sharply to his feet, and in that moment the boss had returned, but he was a different boss from the cold man he'd been for 6 years, a man whose compassion was no longer a weakness, but had become the force driving him forward. He shouted for Angelo, ordered the car and the men prepared, and as he strode back inside to get his weapons, his mind was already working with the sharpness of a strategist, fitting every piece of information together. The dog came from Voss's operation. Ruby and Poppy had been taken by Voss. And somewhere behind all of it was the hand of the insider he had already begun to suspect. He understood that this was not simply a kidnapping for ransom, that there was a larger scheme being set in motion, very likely a trap designed to lure him in. But he also knew that even if it was a trap, he would still go, because leaving Ruby and her little girl in those men's hands was something he could never live with for even one more day. Nadine called to report that the dog had broken out of the clinic, and Vince told her it was with him, that it had done exactly what it needed to do, then instructed her to take care of the puppy and keep it safe at any cost. When he stepped outside again, the black dog was still waiting beside the car, stubbornly refusing to stay behind though its body was exhausted, and Vince understood that the animal wanted to go with them, wanted to lead the way, wanted to be there when the woman it owed was rescued. He did not stop it, because he knew that if anyone in this world had the right to be there in the fateful hour to come, it was the loyal dog that had begun all of this with one look through a pane of glass. And now, beneath the freezing night sky of Providence, man and animal plunged into the darkness together, carrying one shared determination that this time, no one would have to die because of a single second of hesitation. Inside a private family warehouse hidden along the edge of the harbor, Vince gathered a small group of the few men he could still trust completely, and that number was painfully small, because after weeks of suspicion about the insider, he'd been forced to leave out of the plan anyone who'd ever had close ties to Cormac, which meant that tonight he would be walking into battle with a force far thinner than anything his empire could have summoned. Angelo stood beside him, spreading out a map of the area where they believed Voss was holding Ruby and Poppy, an old warehouse complex buried deep in the abandoned industrial district south of the city, the place that, according to the clues they'd pieced together, was where the dog-fighting boss still held his brutal underground matches. Vince listened as Angelo analyzed the entrances, the blind spots, the places where the hostages were most likely being kept, but part of his mind still hung in the unease that this was very likely a trap already set for him, that the enemy wanted him to come, that they'd calculated every move he would make. He said that openly to his men, without hiding the level of danger, because he wasn't the kind of commander who pushed other people toward death with lies, and he gave each of them the choice to step away without judgment. Not one man walked out, and in the steady eyes of those loyal men, Vince recognized something he had almost forgotten. Through 6 years of living in suspicion, that true loyalty still existed, that not everything around him had rotted away with betrayal. But even as he laid out every detail of the plan with the coldness of a seasoned strategist, deep inside his chest an old fear was stirring, a fear no order could silence, the fear that when the deciding moment came, when everything moved too fast and a life hung by a thread, he would freeze again as he had in the warehouse 6 years ago. The ghost of that 1 second of hesitation still haunted him, and he knew that if history repeated itself tonight, if he fell 1 heartbeat behind again, then this time the ones who paid the price would be an innocent woman and a child with a fragile heart, and he wouldn't have enough soul left to survive another loss like that. He tightened his hand around the red collar still tucked inside his coat pocket, using it as an anchor, reminding himself that the dog outside had taught him a lesson without words. That courage wasn't the absence of fear but action in spite of it, that if a wounded and exhausted creature could run across half the city for another life, then he could move past the ghost inside himself. The black dog lay low near the warehouse door, breathing heavily but with its eyes still open, following every movement Vince made with tireless vigilance, and when he stepped closer, it forced itself to stand, ready, as though it understood its role in this night was not yet finished. Nadine had come at Vince's request, carrying supplies to bandage the animal temporarily, and she warned him that the dog was at the limit of what it could endure, that every step it ran from here might be its last. But when she tried to hold it back, the animal gave a low growl and firmly moved toward the door, and both Vince and Nadine understood that no force could stop it from following the path it had chosen to the end. Vince decided the dog would lead the way, because its sense of smell and instinct were sharper than any map, and because it had once lived inside Voss's den, had once been caged and tortured there, so no one understood that maze better than it did. When the final preparations were finished, when the weapons had been checked and everyone was in position, Vince stood silently for a moment in the dark warehouse, looking out into the thick night lying over the harbor. And he thought of Ruby with her wary, unyielding eyes, of Poppy with the smile he had only glimpsed a few times, of Tommy and the night he'd lost his brother, of the red collar that had somehow led all of them to this moment. He knew that when he stepped through that warehouse door and plunged into the darkness, he wouldn't only be fighting to save 2 lives, but also to face a truth that had been buried for 6 years. And though he didn't yet know what was waiting for him at the end of the road, he hardened his resolve inside himself, nodded to Angelo, placed his hand on the loyal dog's head, and signaled for them all to move out into the black night, where the storm was already waiting. The abandoned warehouse complex appeared in the night like a sleeping beast, black blocks of concrete lying, motionless beneath the dim moonlight, and only the light leaking through a few cracks in the doors, and the deep muffled sounds echoing from inside betrayed that something dark was happening within. The black dog led the way just as Vince had trusted it to do, slipping through shadowed passages it knew by heart from the days it had been imprisoned, guiding the group around to the back where the guard line was thinnest, and Vince signaled his men to move in absolute silence, because he knew surprise was the only advantage they had against a larger force. They reached the rear door, took down 2 guards quickly and soundlessly, and when Vince stepped inside, the sight before him made his blood boil. A fighting pit enclosed by blood-stained wooden boards, cramped iron cages holding wounded animals, and a crowd of people who had come here to wager on the suffering of living creatures, all of it exposing the cruelty upon which Voss had built his filthy empire. But Vince hadn't come here for the dogs or for the gamblers. He had come for 2 lives, and his eyes swept the space in search of them until the black dog beside him suddenly stopped, lifted its nose, then pulled him toward a row of small rooms set apart in the far corner of the complex. He split his men up, sending Angelo and several others to create chaos around the fighting pit in order to scatter Voss's forces. Angelo moved with ruthless precision, leading the charge into the main arena and immediately pinning Garrett Voss to the ground before the corrupt ringmaster could even reach for his weapon, neutralizing the outer guards in a flash, while he and the dog moved quietly toward those rooms, his heart pounding with fear over what he might find. When the first gunshot rang out from Angelo's side and the whole complex fell into chaos, Vince used the opening, kicked in the door of the room the dog was clawing at, and in the dim light he saw Poppy, locked alone in a corner, curled up and trembling, her little face soaked with tears but still conscious, and the moment she saw the familiar black dog rush in, her eyes lit up through her terror. Vince knelt beside her, his voice softening in a way he hadn't expected himself to still be capable of, reassuring her that he was her mother's friend, that he had come to take both of them home. And though Poppy had never truly known him, the presence of the dog her mother had told her about, along with the unexpectedly warm voice of the strange man, made her allow him to lift her into his arms. But as he held the little girl and felt that small heart beating frighteningly out of rhythm beneath her thin chest, a new fear took hold of him, because he knew this terror and strain could be deadly for a child with a heart condition, and he had to get her out quickly. He asked Poppy where her mother was, and through her sobs, the child pointed toward another door at the end of the hallway, saying they had separated Mommy from her and taken her away. Vince handed Poppy to one of his men who had just reached them, ordered him to get the child safely outside at once, and have an ambulance waiting, then charged with the black dog toward the door at the end of the hallway, where he believed Ruby was being held. Around him, the fight had spread, gunshots, shouting, the pounding of feet in panic, Voss's men trying to regroup while Vince's men held them back, and in the middle of that storm of violence, Vince kept a cold focus, taking down only those who blocked his path and refusing to be pulled into a meaningless battle, because every passing second was another second Ruby might be in danger. The black dog fought beside him with the ferocity of an animal protecting its pack, stopping a man who had lunged at Vince from behind, and though its body was spent and its wound was bleeding again, it did not retreat, as if it knew that tonight was the night every debt had to be paid. When Vince kicked open the door at the end of the hallway, he saw Ruby tied to a chair, her lip bleeding from fighting back, but her eyes, when they found him, blazed not with the weakness of a victim, but with a fierce flash of hope mixed with horror, and she screamed a warning at him. But it was too late, because from the darkness of the room a voice spoke, A voice Vince recognized at once, and that made his whole world seem to freeze. A voice that didn't belong to Voss, but to the man he had trusted for nearly 15 years. And when that shadow stepped into the light with a gun, aimed straight ahead, Vince found himself facing Cormac Doyle. And he understood that the trap he had always suspected had now snapped shut. Cormac stood there with the gun aimed straight at Vince, a cold smile on the face that for nearly 15 years, Vince had believed belonged to his closest trusted brother. And in that moment, every scattered piece he had gathered over the past weeks suddenly locked into place and became a horrifying picture. He said, in the unhurried tone of a man who had waited far too long for this moment, that the red collar should have stayed beneath the ground forever, that if that damned dog hadn't dug it up, Vince could have lived out the rest of his life in the neat little torment Cormac had worked so hard to create for him. And then, one word at a time, Cormac laid bare the truth that had been buried for 6 years, the truth Vince had both feared and longed to know ever since the first crack appeared in his memory. That night in the warehouse had never been a simple ambush by the enemy. It had been a setup, and Cormac himself had been behind all of it. He said he had grown sick of forever standing in the shadow of the Falcone family, that he believed the empire should have belonged to him, and that to take it, he needed to remove not Vince, who was too strong and too feared to bring down directly, but Tommy, whose death would destroy Vince from within, turning the Iron Boss into a man gnawed hollow by guilt. Easier to manipulate, easier to control. He had secretly told the enemy the place and time of the meeting. He had arranged for Tommy to be there, and most importantly, the detail that made Vince's blood turn cold. He was the one who had pulled the trigger. The shot that killed Tommy that night had not come from the gun of an enemy in the darkness as Vince had always believed. It had come from another angle, from the very hand of the brother Tommy had trusted, and that vague feeling that the bullet had come from the wrong direction, the feeling Vince had pushed aside in the shock of that year, had turned out to be instinct, trying to tell him the truth from the very beginning. Cormac laughed when he saw Vince's face, savoring his pain, and went on to say that for 6 years Vince had blamed himself for a second of hesitation that had never mattered, that the moment he'd thought he had frozen and fallen too late had meant nothing at all, because Tommy had been marked to die that night, no matter how quickly Vince reacted, and the guilt that had shaped his entire self for 6 years was only a false sentence he had passed on himself, based on a story Cormac had built. The red collar, he admitted, had been his only mistake, because after killing Tommy he had taken it from the body as a secret trophy, keeping it locked inside an old junk box at one of Voss's facilities for 6 years. Cormac had forgotten that before his death, Tommy had bred their childhood dog's offspring, a bloodline Cormac later seized and sold off to Voss's brutal pits. That was how this black dog ended up imprisoned in the very same facility. During its recent desperate escape, the starving animal had torn through the facility's discarded crates in search of food, instantly recognizing the scent of its lineage on the faded red leather and smashing the old box open. The faded red leather, once handled by the boy who raised its ancestor, had caught in its jaws as it fled into the night, carrying it back to the diner like a blind twist of fate, demanding justice. Vince stood there listening to everything, and inside his chest a storm of opposing emotions roared all at once. Terrible fury toward the man who had stolen his brother and manipulated him for 6 years, but tangled within it, undeniable, was a painful release. Because for the first time after all this time, he understood that Tommy's death wasn't his fault, that he hadn't frozen out of cowardice, that his hand hadn't been slower than fate, that he had only been another victim of the same betrayal that had killed his brother. The burden he had carried for 6 years, the guilt that had hollowed out his soul and turned him into a cold man, who didn't dare believe in goodness, was now being lifted from his shoulders by the triumphant confession of the very man who had placed it there. And inside that release was a pain even deeper than the old one, because knowing his brother had died because of betrayal, and not chance, made the loss many times more brutal. Cormac raised the gun higher and said everything would end here now, that Vince, the woman, and the dog would all disappear tonight, and the story would be told that the Falcone boss had died in a reckless raid on an enemy's den, clearing the path for Cormac to step into the position he believed was his. But as his finger tightened on the trigger, Cormac made the very mistake every overconfident traitor made. He was so busy, savoring victory, that he forgot there was another living creature in the room. A creature that had quietly gathered the last of its strength, a creature carrying in its blood a loyalty passed down through generations. And the black dog's eyes were now locked on the man, aiming a gun at the people it had sworn to protect. Time seemed to slow into separate fragments as Cormac's finger tightened on the trigger, and in that fateful instant Vince felt the old ghost rise inside his chest. The fear that he would freeze again the way he had in the warehouse 6 years earlier, that history was about to repeat itself, and once more he would be one heartbeat slower than death. His entire life since the night he lost Tommy had been shaped by the obsession with this exact moment, and now it was coming for him, bare and merciless, a life he treasured hanging by a thread again, while his hand seemed too slow for the will screaming inside him. But this time, he wasn't the one who broke that moment, because before his will could turn into action, the black dog moved. With the last bit of strength left in its exhausted and wounded body, the animal launched itself with a leap it shouldn't have had the strength to make, pouring everything that remained of its life into one single act, and it threw itself straight between Cormac's gun barrel and the people it had sworn to protect at the very instant the shot cracked through the cramped room. The bullet meant for Vince buried itself in the dog's body, and it fell onto the concrete floor with a cry of pain that made Ruby's heart feel as though it had shattered inside her chest. A cry both Vince and Ruby would hear echoing in their minds for a long time afterward. But that very instant of sacrifice created the opening Vince needed, the half-second that tonight, unlike 6 years ago, he didn't let pass uselessly. He didn't freeze. He didn't hesitate. His whole being exploded into action as he lunged forward and took Cormac down before the man could pull the trigger a second time, knocking the gun from his hand and pinning him to the floor with all the strength of a man who had just been freed from 6 years of guilt and had just watched a loyal life fall because of him. At the same time, Angelo burst into the room with the rest of the men, and when one of Cormac's men tried to raise a gun from a dark corner toward Vince, Angelo stopped him in time, proving through action what Vince needed to know more than ever on this chaotic night of betrayal, that true loyalty still existed around him, that not everyone he trusted had sold him out, and that the young bodyguard who had quietly investigated alongside him through all these weeks was a man into whose hands he could place his life without regret. The battle around them quickly turned once the leader had been subdued, and Voss's men lost heart and scattered, many of them throwing down their weapons and fleeing into the night, when they realized the tide had shifted. But Vince could barely pay attention to any of that anymore, because the moment Cormac was tied down and made harmless, he let him go and dropped to his knees beside the black dog lying weakly in a pool of its own blood. Ruby, once Angelo had cut her bonds, staggered forward and knelt on the other side of the animal, and the two of them bent over the life that had saved them, tears rolling down both their faces without restraint. The dog lifted its head with painful effort, its sorrowful eyes searching Vince's face before moving to Ruby's, and in those eyes there was no fear or blame, only a strange peace, as though it understood that it had completed the thing it had come into this world to do, as though after all the years of being tortured and cast aside in the darkness, it had finally found a reason worthy of giving everything. Vince placed his trembling hand on the animal's huge scarred head, and this time it wasn't a gesture of promise, but a plea from the deepest part of him. He told it, his voice breaking in a way no one had ever heard from the Falcone boss, that it wasn't allowed to die, that it had saved him, and now it was his turn to save it, that he wouldn't lose another loyal life in his lifetime. He shouted for Nadine, who, according to the plan, was still waiting nearby, and ordered the dog taken to surgery at once no matter the cost. And as careful arms lifted the animal, its eyes still didn't leave the two people kneeling beside it, clinging to life by the very reason it had just found. Ruby threw her arms around Vince in that chaotic moment, not as a victim clinging to her rescuer, but as two people who had just walked through hell together and witnessed an act of love so pure that it lit up even the thick darkness around them. And in that embrace, with the sound of ambulance sirens already beginning to wail, in the distance where Poppy was being cared for, Vince felt something he'd thought he'd lost forever, in the warehouse 6 years earlier. Hope fragile but real, that tonight the story wouldn't end with another grave, but with a second chance for all the living beings who had endured far too much pain, and that perhaps, After all these years spent in darkness, he too deserved such a chance. After the black dog had been rushed into emergency care, and Ruby and Poppy were being looked after by his men, Vince returned to the room where Cormac was still bound, and in that moment, as he stood looking down at the man who had stolen his brother from him and manipulated his entire life for 6 years, a dark fury surged through him with such force that it nearly drowned out every trace of reason. Cormac's gun was now in his hand, loaded, and no one in this room would have stopped him or condemned him if he pulled the trigger, because in their world, this was the ending a traitor deserved. This was justice according to the unwritten law he had lived by his entire life. Cormac looked up at him, and in his eyes there was no plea for mercy, only resignation mixed with contempt, as though he had already calculated this death, as though he believed the man he had spent 6 years turning into a cold machine would surely pull the trigger without hesitation. And it was that look, Cormac's certainty that Vince would kill him in blind rage, that made the hand gripping the gun go still. Because Vince suddenly understood something profound in that moment, that if he pulled the trigger now, if he let fury control him, and killed a man who had already been subdued and made harmless, then he would only become exactly the person Cormac had shaped him to be, a creature of darkness no longer able to tell the difference between justice and revenge. And if that happened, then even in death Cormac would still win, would still claim the final victory by dragging Vince down to his own level. He thought of the black dog lying on the operating table, the animal that had taught him that true strength didn't lie in never hesitating, but in knowing when hesitation was right, in knowing how to stop at the exact moment compassion needed to speak. For 6 years, he had blamed himself for 1 second of hesitation in the warehouse, had believed hesitation was a fatal weakness that had to be destroyed. But now he realized that this pause, this stopping before killing a man who could no longer fight back, wasn't weakness at all. It was the very thing that separated him from men like Cormac and Voss. It was the last piece of humanity he hadn't yet lost. Slowly, he lowered the gun, and he watched the contempt in Cormac's eyes turn into confusion, then into a fear even greater than the fear of death, because the man understood that Vince had chosen a road he hadn't foreseen, a road that robbed him of the tragic, heroic ending he had imagined, and instead forced him to face the consequences while still alive. Vince told him, his voice cold but no longer wild with rage, that death would be too easy and too merciful for him, that he would have to live to answer for what he had done, and that Vince would hand him over to people who could make him accountable in a way a bullet never could. He had prepared for this, because during the days of quiet investigation with Angelo, he had silently gathered enough evidence about Voss's operation, about the filthy transactions, about the connections that authorities could not afford to ignore, and now he used those very things to build an ending that did not spill more meaningless blood. Voss's dog-fighting ring was exposed. The boss and his men were arrested that night. The tortured animals were freed, and the evidence Vince carefully brought into the light was enough to make certain that neither Voss nor Cormac would ever see freedom again. He did not carry out the justice of the darkness with his own hands the way his old self surely would have done, but chose a harder path that allowed him to keep his soul. And in that choice there was a kind of growth that 6 years of suffering had not been able to give him, but that a loyal dog and a stubborn woman had. When he stepped out of the warehouse complex just as dawn began to break, leaving behind the wail of sirens as the authorities poured in, he felt a strange relief inside his chest, not joy, because the loss of 6 years could not be erased, but something close to peace, the feeling of a man who had just set down a burden that had pressed on his shoulders far too long, and, for the first time in all that time, could stand upright and breathe. He knew the road ahead was still long, that the wound inside him would not heal at once, that his empire now needed to be rebuilt from the ashes of betrayal. But for the first time he faced the future not with fear or numbness, but with something he had thought he had lost forever in that warehouse years ago, the ability to choose what kind of man he wanted to become, and he had chosen not to let the tragedy of the past define the rest of his life. Before leaving, he looked at Cormac one last time without saying a word, because the silence of a man who had chosen humanity over revenge was the heaviest answer of all for the man who had tried to turn him into a monster. Angelo stepped up beside him, and in the young bodyguard's eyes there was a new respect. Not the fear a subordinate usually gave a boss, but the admiration reserved for a man who had just proven that the greatest power did not lie in the ability to take a life, but in the ability to hold back from doing it when the whole world was certain he would. The black dog survived, though that night it had come so close to death that Nadine had to spend many hours at the operating table, pulling it back from death's hands. And when she finally came out to say it would make it through, Vince stood silently outside the surgery room for a long time. A man who had once made all of Providence afraid, now trembling because one animal would live. But that survival wasn't complete in the way fairy tales like to promise, because the bullet and the layers of old injuries left still more scars on the dog's body. One of its hind legs walked with a slight limp from then on, and on certain nights when the weather turned, it still whimpered softly from the dull ache in its old wound. It didn't become a healthy and carefree animal. It still carried on its body the traces of everything it had endured, but those very scars were now medals of loyalty, living proof that it had loved and protected to the end. Vince adopted it, along with the little puppy it had nearly died protecting in that cold alley, the puppy now stronger under Nadine's careful hands, and he gave the big dog a name, Duke, not because it was the dog from his and Tommy's childhood returned to him, but because in it he saw the same loyalty and unconditional love that the Duke from years ago had taught the two brothers, a thread tying the lost past to a present that was slowly being mended. He brought both dogs back to the mansion on the hill, and the house that had once been as cold as an empty fortress began to fill with the sounds of life. The clicking of claws on hardwood floors, the heavy breathing of the enormous animal lying beside the fireplace. Small things Vince had never imagined could have such power to heal. Poppy underwent heart surgery soon after that fateful night, and this time Vince no longer had to hide his name, because Ruby had come to understand that some gifts were not meant to buy someone or diminish the receiver's dignity, but simply came from a heart that had learned how to love again. The surgery was successful, and when Ruby saw her daughter's lips turn rosy for the first time, instead of the faint blue shade that had haunted her for so many years, she cried, not the tears of despair she knew too well, but tears of a joy she had almost forgotten how to feel. But even in that happiness, Ruby kept the stubborn dignity that had shaped who she was. She didn't allow herself to become the woman rescued and sheltered by a wealthy boss. She went back to work at the Copper Kettle as soon as Poppy was strong enough, firmly paid her own rent with her own wages, and when Vince offered to take care of everything for the two of them, she gently but decisively refused, explaining that she was grateful to him beyond anything words could express, but she needed to remain herself, needed to know she could still stand on her own 2 feet, because that was the one thing that had kept her from collapsing through all those hard years. And Vince, who had once believed every problem could be solved with money and power, now respected that choice, even cherished her more because of it, because he understood that this very unyielding independence was what had drawn him to her from the beginning. The relationship blossomed slowly and carefully, like two people life had wounded learning by touch how to trust again, with no rushed vows and no perfect romantic ending, only mornings when he stopped by the diner for coffee and conversation with her, afternoons when he took Poppy walking with the 2 dogs, ordinary moments they both treasured, precisely because they understood the price of losing them. Neither Vince nor Ruby was fully healed after everything they had been through. He still had nights when he woke with images of Tommy, and now even Cormac in his mind still had to learn how to live with the bitter truth that his brother had died because of betrayal. And she still carried the guardedness of the years she had spent afraid, still had moments when the instinct to protect herself rose up and made her step back. They didn't heal each other by some miracle, because people don't work that way, but they gave each other something more precious, the patience to carry their scars together, the understanding of 2 people who knew that love wasn't erasing the past, but continuing forward together in spite of it. The black dog lay between them on those afternoons, its huge scarred head resting on Poppy's leg, its sorrowful eyes now touched by a peace that a lifetime of cruelty had never let it know. And every time Vince looked at it, he was reminded that even the most wounded living beings, those the world had cast aside and called worthless, could still love, could still be loyal, could still find a home, and perhaps the same was true of him as well. As for May, who had quietly witnessed everything from behind her coffee counter, She only smiled when she saw the man who had once sat alone by the corner window now walk into the diner with a child holding his hand and 2 dogs following behind, because she had lived long enough to know that sometimes the most beautiful new life sprouted from the very ground that had once been torn open by sorrow. Many months after that fateful night, the Copper Kettle was still the shabby little working-class diner, tucked into the corner of Federal Street as it had always been. But for the people fate had driven here, it had become something else, a home none of them had ever thought they would find. In the mornings, Ruby still tied on her apron and poured coffee, but her eyes no longer carried that exhausted weariness from the old days, and Poppy's laughter now rang strong and bright between the tables, as the little girl ran and played with a heart that had been made whole. May still stood behind the counter with her glasses slipping low on the bridge of her nose, watching everything with the eyes of a woman who had seen too much to be easily surprised, but had never lost the ability to cherish rare good things. Angelo stopped by now and then, no longer only a bodyguard, but part of this small, warm circle, and Vince, the man who had once sat alone by the corner window with a cold cup of coffee, now walked into the diner not as a boss who spread fear, but as someone familiar, often with a child holding his hand and 2 dogs ambling behind him. In the mansion on the hill, on the wooden shelf where Vince kept the only photograph of Tommy that remained, there was now another object, the worn red leather collar, cleaned and placed with honor beside the frame. No longer a bleeding wound, but a symbol of the truth finally brought into the light, of a younger brother cleared of false shadows, and of a reminder that loyalty sometimes comes from the places we least expect. The black dog he called Duke often lay beneath that shelf on sunny afternoons, its huge scarred head resting on its front paws, as though it understood that it had been the one to carry that piece of the past home, and close a chapter that had haunted this family for far too long. On the wall behind May's counter, there was now a small framed photograph she had hung with her own hands, a quick snapshot showing Ruby laughing, Poppy sitting on Vince's shoulders, Angelo standing beside them, and the enormous black dog lying at all their feet, a family portrait of people who shared no blood but had chosen one another in a world full of calculation. The diner's regulars gradually grew used to their presence, and no one seemed to remember that the man who often sat in that corner had once been the name that made the whole city lower its voice, because now they saw only a father, a friend, a man who knew how to listen and how to smile softly at the innocent stories of a child. One spring morning, when the first sunlight of the season finally pushed away the lingering cold of the Providence winter, Vince sat again at the old table by the window, the very place where everything had begun, and he looked out at the street now filled with light. On the sidewalk in front of the diner, where a starving dog had once searched through trash in the snow, 2 small muddy paw prints now curved toward the door, the tracks of a dog that had just run inside in search of warmth and the hands of those who loved it. And Vince looked at those 2 paw prints for a long time, because in them he saw an entire journey, from a living creature cast out into the cold to a member welcomed into a home, from a lonely morning of remembrance to a life rebuilt from the wreckage of loss. This story, if it leaves anything behind, is a reminder that the dignity of a human being, or of any living creature, is not measured by the power they hold, the money they have, or the appearance the world sees, but by the compassion they dare to give even when it is inconvenient, by the kindness they offer to those others have turned away from. A weary woman still saved scraps of food for a hungry dog. A wounded animal still risked its life for those who had shown it kindness. A powerful man finally learned that stopping because of compassion wasn't weakness but the greatest strength of all. And together they taught us that sometimes the things that save our lives come from the places we least expect, and that respecting a person begins with seeing worth where others see only something to be discarded. If this story has touched your heart in any way, please take a little time to subscribe to the channel, press like, and share this video with the people you love, so that each day we can continue listening together to more meaningful and warm stories about humanity. We would truly love to know how you felt about this story, what it reminded you of in your own life, whether you have ever offered a small kindness without imagining it might change an entire life, or whether you have ever received kindness from the place you least expected. Please leave a comment and share with us the feelings from deep within your heart. because every story you tell may become encouragement for someone else who needs it. Thank you for listening to the story until the very last moment, and I wish everyone watching this video strong health, a joyful life, peace, and love filling every day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next videos.